I guess we can get started. It'll be a few minutes of introduction, so hopefully people that are having difficulty getting on, such as uh, Kamilla just mentioned, will all be able to figure this out during a brief introduction. I just had a few words to say at the beginning, and then I'm going to hand it off to the much more important people, those that you actually really want to hear from today. Today is actually a really special day, one that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. We get to honor the first recipient of the Science for Health in Indigenous Populations Award, or the SHIP Award, and that's Jalene Herron and her mentor, uh, Kamilla, sounds like Pamela. I liked her name on the screen, Venner. We also have two leading scholars joining us today. We have Dr. Joseph Ghan from Harvard and Dr. trying to find her on the screen. There it is, Karina Walters from the University of Washington. So we're very honored and we welcome you to joining us today to celebrate Jalene's work. Thank you very much for being here. Also, we have the Vice President for Research at the University of New Mexico, Ellen Fisher, who would like to say a few words in a moment. And then we'd like to also thank the people that created this award. That's Doctors Rob Duncan and Annie Sobel. And they will say a few words in a moment too. And they'll probably tell us a little bit about why they've established this award, but I think it's a fabulous award that should make a difference in encouraging and supporting young scientists moving into this research field to address the health disparities in American Indian and Alaska Native communities. With that, I want to hand it off to Dr. Ellen Fisher, but actually I forgot to state one thing. During the talks, we aren't going to address questions because after Jalene speaks and our two invited guests are able to speak, then we'll have a roundtable that Kamilla Venner will be hosting. And if you just can post questions into the chat, then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the roundtable discussion. With that, let me hand it off to Dr. Fisher, who would like to say a couple words.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jeremy. And I'd like to offer my own welcome and thank you for attending this inaugural symposium of the Science for Health in Indigenous Populations Award. I am Ellen Fisher, Vice President for Research and Professor of Chemistry at University of New Mexico. As New Mexico's only designated R1 research university, we take pride in our science and our people. UNM can lead the way in addressing health and social disparities among the Indigenous community in New Mexico and in other parts of the world toward a more equitable future, and this award is just one step towards that goal. We are very grateful to Rob Duncan, former Arts and Sciences Associate Dean for Research and founding director of the New Mexico Consortium, and Annie Sobel, Doctor of Medicine and Associate Professor at Texas Tech University's Health Science Center, for their generous contributions to make this award possible. They are truly leading by example in the effort to inclusively translate scientific research to healthcare opportunities across all populations. Thank you so much, and I look so forward to hearing the talks this morning. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeremy.
Oh, thank you so much. So I think Dr. Duncan and Dr. Sobel had a few words they just wanted to say at the beginning. And then after that, Kamilla will then be able to introduce Jalene. So Dr. Duncan and Sobel.
Thank you so much. Rob and I are so delighted to play a small role in this symposium, and we're very committed personally and professionally to the science that's underlying the purpose of this the SHIP Prize. Personally, as a family physician and also residency trained in aerospace and occupational medicine, I've seen the need for holistic understanding of health and also the importance of underscoring the current day science and technology and understanding medical preventive medicine and also anticipation of emerging threats to Indigenous populations. There are more than 200 million Indigenous peoples throughout the world, and we recognize the significant role that the United States Southwest plays in understanding the underlying science, and we hope that this prize will play an important role in early research and perhaps helping University of New Mexico and its scholars and academics to play a leading role across the United States and potentially globally with its partners in moving forward in this important area of research and technology application. So Rob's going to say a few words now.
Well, thank you very much. And again, let me just first of all start by congratulating UNM for establishing this prize. I'd like very much to thank Jeremy Edwards and co-chair Keith Lidke for all their efforts to bring this together. Yolanda, thank you so much for, again, the efforts in development to make this occur. So really, I'm very appreciative of everyone who did the hard work, you know. And then also, I wanted to very much say that UNM is a great university, of course. And I mean, it's exciting how responsive they are to their community and how everything is really very much about serving their community through UNM, the broader community, as well as the immediate community in New Mexico. And Indigenous people have done so much and continue to do so much for our society. So I guess the thing that motivated us was twofold. One, to recognize that, just the profound importance of the Indigenous populations to our community and Indigenous populations to the communities throughout the world. Secondly, though, we're at a time where messenger RNA and other biotechnologies are making it possible to understand the origin of congenital disease in Indigenous populations. And as we understand that, not only does that lead to new therapeutics, but it also leads to a better understanding of human systems biology, which leads to, again, the advancement of health for all of us. So I think this is a very exciting opportunity. I'd say that certainly it's intended to be comprehensive. So to span the data sciences, social sciences, to really look at the medical sciences and the tie to basic scientific research. And so we see it as very much motivated by the interdisciplinary opportunities. And of course, that's something UNM is extremely dedicated to. So just wanted to express my thanks to such an outstanding university for establishing this prize.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for helping us establish this. So, with that, let's hand this off to Kamilla, who is the faculty mentor of Jalene and also an award winner, because the award not only supports Jalene, but also provides some support for her as well. So.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. So hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm Kamilla Venner. I'm a member of the Chitna Village, which is from the Otna-Athabascan people in Alaska. And I'm an assistant professor of psychology here at UNM, which has been my home for like over 27 years now. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the Sobel Duncan Science for Health in Indigenous Populations award winner, Jalene Herron, who works in my lab. I'm very fortunate to have her in my lab as a third-year clinical psychology graduate student. I'm very grateful to the donors also, Drs. Sobel and Duncan, for dedicating this award to Indigenous health. It really aids in promoting the value in academia of this research and really helps promote it and promote young scholars. So Jalene is the ideal candidate for this award. First, she's Indigenous. She's worked at the National Congress of American Indians to influence policy for American Indian Alaska Native health, and she's focused her research on improving substance use outcomes for American Indian Alaska Natives. So first, Jalene is Yupik. She's a fellow Alaska Native. She's from one of the 11 distinct Alaska Native cultural groups. She grew up in a village, a small village called Bethel, Alaska, about 6,000 people. And then went on to earn her bachelor's degree at Gonzaga University and her master's degree here at UNM, and now she's a doctoral candidate. She has already published 14 journal articles and has more under review and in preparation, so she's been extremely productive. I highly recommended Jalene for this award as her research has remained focused on improving Indigenous health and bringing in cultural lenses to improve our science. So Jalene's a rising star and walks confidently in two worlds, the UPIC and the US mainstream worlds. And I look forward to watching her trajectory unfold and see how she impacts our field. Sorry. Whew. In our Indigenous communities. So I'm going to turn it over to Jalene to talk to us about contingency management in American Indian communities. Join me in welcoming Jalene.
Thank you so much, Kamilla, for those really kind words. I will go ahead and try to share my screen pretty seamlessly. There we go. All right, so yeah, again, thank you, Kamilla. Thank you. I just want to, again, thank the donors, Dr. Sobel and Duncan, for really highlighting Indigenous health and Indigenous health research. I really value this. I'd also just like to state what an honor it is to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues of Dr. Ghan and Dr. Walters. Their work has influenced me since I was an undergraduate student, really getting into this field, and has really inspired me and influenced my work in this realm of including culture in our science. So it's just such a huge honor. So I'll be talking about my master's thesis. This project is actually under tribal review, and I had to get tribal approval to present this, and it didn't come in until 9 o'clock this morning. So I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but it came in time. So I'm really happy and really excited to share all of this information with you. So the data that I'm presenting to you all today is from the HONOR project. HONOR stood for Helping Our Native Ongoing Recovery. This project was a partnership between Washington State University and 3 distinct American Indian and Alaska Native communities. This project was funded by NIH to Dr. Michael McDonnell and Dr. Deidre Buchwald at Washington State University. I worked at WSU from 2016 to 2018 as a research coordinator prior to coming to graduate school. And this project was my main focus for those 2 years. So I knew the data really well as the administrator and working with the 3 tribal communities. So I'm really grateful that coming to graduate school, I was able to continue working with these communities and working with my previous mentors. Most of my presentation today is from just one site, so it's a secondary data analysis of this project. So I just want to provide a little bit of background on American Indians and Alaska Native in the realm of substance use, which is where my research primarily resides. So within American Indian and Alaska Native communities, we see high rates of lifetime alcohol abstinence in comparison to the general population. Specifically here in the Southwest, this is also a particular strength. We see that Southwest American Indians have some of the lowest rates of alcohol use in comparison to other American Indians and Alaska Natives. So that's a particular cultural strength in this area. Additionally, though, we also see high rates of alcohol-related health inequities. So alcohol-related morbidity and mortality is a particular struggle within our communities, especially among American Indian men. And this is related, I think, whenever we talk about health inequities, it's really important to recognize the context of where this all comes from. So within the broader pattern of colonization in the United States, a variety of historical and political factors influence health outcomes. So US policy towards American Indians has attempted to terminate and assimilate American Indians, both land and people. And so those influence our health outcomes across generations. And then additionally, there's often a lack of culturally relevant services and treatments for alcohol use disorder. While there are treatments for alcohol use disorder in the general population, these treatments are very rarely developed specifically for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And very rarely are they included in efficacy trials and evaluations. And so we don't really know the research on if these are effective. This is changing though. There's a lot of really great research being done across the country to develop culturally grounded treatments for alcohol use disorder, to culturally tailor them. My mentors, Dr. Venner and Dr. McDonald, are both national experts in this and really leading this work for our communities. And so there's work being done, but these health inequities still exist and we still need to work on addressing them. And then just as important to the background, I think it's really important to expand on my own positionality as a researcher. This informs my work just as much. Who I am and where I come from influence how I see the world and how I do this research and why I do this research. So like Kamilla mentioned, I'm Yupik. I grew up in Bethel, which is a small community. It's inaccessible by car. You can only fly in or boat in. So growing up in a rural community really shaped who I am as a person. My parents and my siblings both still live in Bethel, and their cost of living is really high. The internet quality is really poor, and they pay such it's so expensive to live there. And so while that's a barrier sometimes to living in a rural community, there's also so much opportunity for cultural engagement. So I grew up super connected to my cultural identity. I grew up hearing Yupik on the radio and my family. It's not my first language, but I do speak some Yupik. And my family did subsistence fishing and hunting. And some of my fondest memories growing up were berry picking with my mom on the same land that her and her mom used to pick berries. So that continuity is really important to me. It's informed how I just value culture so much. But also important to note, while I'm wholly a Yupik person, I don't quantify my identity. I'm also bicultural. I grew up with a Native mother and a white father. And so because of this, I have a level of white privilege. I've had incredible access to education and opportunities that now put me in a position to where I can be in graduate school. Additionally, I'm an auntie. So in Yupik culture, aunties are have an important role to be teasing and loving. And I've been an auntie since I was 5, actually. And so it's always been a part of my identity. And it's important. It forms the work I want to do. I have 7 nieces and nephews, and I want them to grow up in a world that's more equitable and just than the one I did. And so this is why I do the work. This is who I do the work for. And this is why I think culture is important. So the Indigenous stress coping model has been really influential in my work. This was published by Dr. Karina Walters and her colleagues at University of Washington. And this really incorporates both culturally specific risk and protective factors that can aid in coping with different stressors that happen to Native people in their life. And so some of the specific protective factors that can influence substance use outcomes specifically include this idea as culture as treatment. So often when you go into American Indian communities, this is sort of like common knowledge. Dr. Ghan has also published on this work that tribal leaders, Native people, they will say American Indian culture, Native culture in and of itself is a form of healing. It's considered a pathway to recovery from alcohol use disorder. And so this is really a concept built into communities and is represented in community knowledge. Traditional Western research shows us that cultural identity and involvement is a protective factor. Research with American Indian youth shows this, that cultural identity matters and is protective against the development of an alcohol use disorder. Additionally, Dr. Kimberlyhauser, who used to be at UNM, she published this research showing that American Indians who spent more years of their life on the reservation actually had less mental health distress than American Indians who spent more years of their life off the reservation. So we know that reservation life can be protective against distress, and these are important concepts that we should be conceptualizing and thinking about with health outcomes, especially in substance use and alcohol use. Additionally, in this Indigenous stress coping model, there are culturally specific risk factors that we need to talk about. In particular, discrimination can influence health outcomes. So we see that American Indian youth, when discrimination is measured, we see it can predict substance use outcomes. Additionally, this idea about historical loss and historical trauma. So this is something, when you go to tribal communities, historical trauma is also really a part of the vernacular, and people will kind of conceptualize historical trauma as almost an explanation for a lot of the health inequities that exist in tribal communities. There is a measure to look at historical trauma, and it's been shown to predict alcohol use disorder. So people who are more likely to score higher, have more conceptualization of historical loss and trauma, are more likely to have an alcohol use disorder. So these things are important in our conceptualization and has influenced my own work and why I want to look at culture and its relationship to alcohol outcomes and treatment. So in particular, so the study I talked about, this honor project, it was testing contingency management. And so contingency management is one of the most effective interventions for drug use. So it's effective at reducing methamphetamine use and cocaine use. You know, there's actually few interventions that are effective for these drugs in particular, but it hasn't been tested a lot in alcohol use disorder. So in contingency management, how it was applied as a part of the honor project. So the target behavior for contingency management in this intervention was alcohol abstinence. And so the whole idea behind contingency management is that you provide a reward when the target behavior occurs. So CM is very simple. It's rooted in the basics of operant conditioning. So you provide the reward when the target behavior occurs. And then the longer the period of abstinence, the larger the reward gets over time. And then simply to when the target behavior doesn't occur, when alcohol is used, when the interventionist would remove the reward and invite people to come back to the next visit. So this intervention, I'll talk a little bit more about the study design in the next few slides, but in this intervention, they targeted alcohol use using a biomarker, so ethylglucuronide or ETG. And ETG is a metabolite produced by your liver, and it is assessed in your urine. And so ETG can detect alcohol use for up to 5 days for heavy drinking and up to 2 days for light drinking. Previous work in this area has shown that CM is culturally appropriate and was culturally tailored in this setting to be appropriate for use in the 3 communities where the study was implemented. And in this case, contingency management was tested against a non-contingent control group. So in a control group, the target behavior is essentially attendance of visits. So the target behavior was attendance. So regardless of people's alcohol use, they were able to get the reward. So this was the honor project's study design. It was a total 7-month intervention. Following baseline, there was a 4-week pre-randomization induction phase where individuals came in twice a week for 4 weeks and provided the alcohol samples and got information. Basically, this was to get people to get used to CM, get used to coming in so regularly. And then if people attended at least 4 visits of the induction phase and had 1 alcohol positive sample, they were randomized to receive one of the interventions. So for the purpose of my talk today, I'll really be only looking at the 12 weeks of treatment. So I really wanted to see how these cultural factors that I hypothesized, how they influenced alcohol outcomes during these 12 weeks of treatment and across treatment groups. So in terms of like the actual study sample that was recruited and that I'm analyzing for this project, people were recruited from a rural reservation. They were American Indians who were interested in cutting down their alcohol use. They had a diagnosis of the DSM from the DSM-4 of alcohol dependence, and they had one heavy drinking episode in the last 30 days. This was my consort diagram. So we see that about 186 people were consented, but we had a relatively high dropout rate. So often the most common reason that people weren't randomized is because they attended less than 4 visits. But overall, my analytic sample was 65 people, 31 of which who are assigned to contingency management and 34 to the control group. So I had 3 main hypotheses kind of based on previous literature, based on what I was interested in looking at these culturally specific risk and protective factors. So my first hypothesis was looking at protective factors and hypothesized here that higher rates of enculturation and more years lived on the reservation would be associated with lower rates of alcohol use. And then the second hypothesis here was that individuals with higher rates of risk factors, so defined by higher scores of discrimination, reporting more historical loss and historical loss symptoms, would have higher rates of alcohol use. Then the third hypothesis here was really looking at treatment effect and seeing how if enculturation, so people who are more highly enculturated, if that moderated the intervention at all, I assumed that the CM treatment would be more effective for people with higher rates of enculturation. So these were so I mentioned all of the kind of protective factors and risk factors that I wanted to look at. These are the actual measures I used. So enculturation was measured using the American Indian Enculturation Scale, which asks about cultural identity and cultural involvement. I utilized the perceived discrimination scale, which is actually specific to the experience of American Indians. And then I used the historical loss scale, which asks about how often people think about historical losses. So things like a loss of land, a loss of language. And then the historical loss associated symptoms was when people think about those losses, what do they feel? Do they feel angry? Do they feel sad? Questions like that. Then I also looked at years lived on the reservation. Biologically, or sex assigned at birth was the control variable I used. And then the dependent variable I looked at was alcohol use. And I actually looked at 2 different outcomes for alcohol use. So I mentioned the use of ETG, ethyl gluconoride. So I actually looked at 2 different cutoffs for it. So this first cutoff, where I have it labeled positive, negative based on the 150 nanograms cutoff, that basically is identifying any recent alcohol use. And so that's kind of the standard in the ETG CM literature, looking at defining recent drinking. But I also wanted to look at heavier drinking and seeing how that is kind of impacting these outcomes. So based on this cutoff of 500 ETG, which is kind of like previous research shows that is pretty good as a number for predicting more like binge drinking. And so I used that cutoff as well. So how did I look at this? I utilized generalized linear mixed modeling to look at the outcomes, abstinence, and heavy drinking across the 12 weeks of the intervention. People came in twice a week, so there was 24 instances of these outcome variables. And then I looked at the predictors from baseline. So baseline measures of enculturation, discrimination, historical loss, and then their lifetime years lived on the reservation. And then also looking at the interaction. So in terms of like baseline demographics, I don't know how well you can see this, it's kind of small on my screen, but that average age of people in the study was around 36. Slightly more than half were male. Most people had a high school education. A pretty significant proportion, 43%, were unstably housed at the time of the intervention, and about 72% were unemployed within the last 30 days. So we actually see that slightly. I'm looking here at this negative alcohol sample. So about 56% of people who came in at baseline hadn't drank in recent days, and about 29% were heavy drinkers, we might call, at the time of intervention or baseline. So these were kind of the results from the analysis. It's kind of a lot to look at, so I'll try to break it down pretty simply. So this was, this first model 1 was looking at all the cultural variables and predicting any alcohol use during the intervention. So this is based on the 150 ETG cutoff. So it's the likelihood of submitting an alcohol positive sample during the intervention. So if you look at the p-values, nothing really came out quite as significant except for treatment in this group. So none of these cultural factors that I hypothesized really came out as predicting substance use during the 12 weeks of the intervention. So this is the second model now, and here we're predicting heavy drinking. So this is based on the ETG cutoff of 500. And so we actually see that enculturation comes out as a significant predictor. So individuals who are higher on enculturation at the time of baseline during the intervention were less likely to submit a sample that was indicative of recent heavy drinking. This next model is really looking here at the interaction between treatment group and enculturation. So this is predicting, again, predicting any alcohol use at the level of ETG 150. So this is predicting the likelihood of submitting an alcohol positive sample during the intervention. And again, here we didn't see any, no, the interaction was not significant across treatment groups. And then looking sort of more at the level of heavy drinking, again, testing this interaction between enculturation and treatment group, we didn't see any significant, the interaction was not significant. So what are kind of like the results after you saw all the numbers? So really what came out was that there was a negative association between enculturation and the likelihood of submitting a heavy drinking sample. So this suggests, based on previous literature and in line with that, that cultural identity and involvement is a protective factor when it comes to binge drinking for those who are enrolled in an alcohol intervention. So we see that SAM is effective really across these various levels of culturally specific risk and protective factors. So how does this line up with other research? So we know that CM is effective in diverse communities. So CM has been tested with Black Americans. We also, CM has been tested in Brazil and even both urban and rural parts of China. And there's some recent literature coming out showing that CM is effective for alcohol use in American Indian communities and effective for drug use in American Indian communities. Additionally, we see that matching previous literature, enculturation is a significant construct in substance use. And so we really should be thinking about enculturation. We should be conceptualizing it as an important factor when it comes to binge drinking, when it comes to people who are involved in alcohol treatment. And then I talked about earlier in my introduction, some of the evidence to support some of these culturally specific risk and protective factors like discrimination, historical loss, and years lived on the reservation. For the most part, these factors have been studied in community populations. So we see this relationship, right, that some of these cultural factors are important in the development of an alcohol use disorder or protective in the development of an alcohol use disorder. But this was a clinical sample. And so these differences might be slightly harder to detect because it's all people existing in the study already had an alcohol use disorder. There's a couple really important strengths and limitations to note. First of all, this, while by most, in other kind of ways, this is considered a small sample size, 65. But for a lot of American Indian and Alaska Native research, 65 is a pretty substantial number. But because of this small sample size, we were underpowered to detect small differences in the study. And important to note, this study, the findings are from a rural reservation, are reflective of people with an alcohol use disorder who are engaged in alcohol treatment. And so these findings might not apply to other tribal communities and other Native people whose experience is not reflected by living on a reservation. Additionally, and really important to note, is that all the measures that I used in my sample have been created or validated specifically for American Indians. So a lot of the time, the measures that we use as researchers are often not created with American Indians in mind or validated for our populations, but these were, and they were actually all pretty reliable in this sample. Also really important to note is that this intervention was delivered in a tribal setting and it employed American Indian staff. And so contingency management doesn't require the use of a specific trained health professional. It can be trained to be delivered really by anyone, which is really important for underserved communities like many American Indian communities where there might be a shortage of providers. So just some broad strokes, broad takeaways from this presentation. CM is an effective intervention for reducing alcohol use among rural reservation adults. We should really consider enculturation. We should be assessing it. We should be asking our clients about it. Even if it isn't important to them or maybe not as significant, we should at least be discussing that with our clients. And given the, kind of the simplicity of contingency management, the ability to sort of implement this intervention and disseminate this intervention, I think is really important for our tribal communities who are looking for culturally relevant treatment options for their people in reducing alcohol use. I have so many people to thank. First of all, I'd really like to thank the participants in their tribal communities. Participants, when they give us their data, sometimes it can just be like biological data, but their stories, their lives, their struggles, they're still reflected in that data. And so I just want to thank their willingness for being able to share this information with us so we can learn and create better interventions. Additionally, when I worked on this project, the study partners and staff were instrumental in making sure this project was a success. And I wouldn't be here and presenting this data without them. Again, I really want to thank Drs. Sobel and Dr. Duncan for creating this award, for acknowledging that UNM resides on the land of the Pueblo of the Sandia and that we should be honoring Native people in our research here at UNM. And I want to thank the SHIP Award Committee for choosing me, allowing me to give this talk and share space with all of you today. Additionally, my thesis committee, who were instrumental in me actually writing this thesis, defending it, Dr. Kamilla Venner, Dr. Michael McDonald, and Dr. Dawood Tofihi. Two of my colleagues who are in my lab, Dr. Kathleen Hershak, she actually worked on this project with me when we both were at WSU, and she's an amazing colleague. I really look up to her as another Native female scholar, and I wouldn't be here without her. Additionally, my lab mate Alex, her and I came in together to grad school in 2018. And she's the one who's working with me on nights and weekends, making sure I reach all my deadlines. And so really wouldn't be here without her support. And then finally, my family, my own Yupik tribal community that really raised me to be who I am. And I wouldn't be here without their love and support. So these are my references. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And I will end my share there.
Jalene, for that outstanding presentation of your work. I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be interesting discussion and questions on your research during the roundtable. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jessica Goodkind. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at UNM. And I also just want to thank Jalene for mentioning tribal approval of your presentation this morning, because I think it highlights the crucial recognition of tribal or indigenous data sovereignty, which is really the right of sovereign tribal nations to control the collection, ownership, and application of their data. And so I hope that we can discuss this further as well during the roundtable. But for now, I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joseph Ghan, who is on the faculty at Harvard University with a dual appointment as a professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in anthropology and on the Faculty of Medicine in global health and social medicine. He's also the faculty director of the Harvard University Native American program. As an interdisciplinary social scientist and a member of the Gros Ventre Tribal Nation of Montana, I think Dr. Ghan really embodies the spirit of the SHIP Award as well. He has collaborated for more than 25 years with American Indian and other indigenous communities on mental health research and community-based mental health services that really recognizes and centers the important roles of traditional culture and spirituality for advancing indigenous well-being. Dr. Ghan has also published more than 75 scientific articles and chapters, and he's received extensive recognition in his fields through numerous fellowships and career awards, including probably most recently the 2021 Seymour B. Saracen Award for Community Research and Action from Division 27 of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Ghan is also a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and 7 divisions of the American Psychological Association. I feel really fortunate to have had the opportunity not only to read and learn from Dr. Ghan's work, but also to interact with him through his longtime involvement in the field of community psychology and the Society for Community Research and Action. So I could go on and on, but I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Ghan for now so that we can hear directly from him. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for that, Professor Goodkind. That's a very kind and warm introduction, and I appreciate all that you've said. And Jalene, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation and for attending to cultural strengths that are so important in the futures of our communities, particularly when it comes to combating some of these problems that have been problems for a little while. So let me make sure that, okay, fantastic. I'm in commemoration and in honor of Jalene, I'm pleased to talk to you today about what I call the post-colonial predicament in community mental health services for American Indians, explorations in alternative science. And I'll explain that subtitle when it becomes appropriate to do so. Let me just state by way of introduction that I'm talking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Harvard University sits in the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. As Professor Goodkind said, I'm a member of the Aani-Grovant Tribal Nation of Montana. We're at Fort Belknap. I joined Harvard about 3 years ago, so I think I'm finally a little oriented here, but it's been a big transition. I'm an academic psychologist. You heard I'm in anthropology and in medicine, but I'm actually a psychologist by training, so go figure. Clinically trained, community engaged in all of my work, culturally attuned in some of the ways that Jalene has really demonstrated today. So your work is, after my own heart here. My research interests are broadly at this intersection of coloniality and mental health. Indigenous psychologies are something that have attracted a lot of my investigatory attention, and specifically on cross-cultural therapies as well. So what I want to do today is to just go back to an early part of my career where I learned a lesson that kind of charted or helped to pave the direction I would follow, and to unpack that for you a little bit so you can appreciate some things that struck me early on and I think make a big difference for how we think about this endeavor of mental health in Indian communities. Obviously, it's pretty widely known at this point that many American Indian communities suffer from mental health disparities or inequities. We have, in some cases, epidemic levels of distress in our communities. This is often measured through high prevalence of trauma, of substance abuse, suicide in particular. At the same time, the mental health services that are available to us, usually funded by the Indian Health Service, are underfunded. And they've been underfunded forever. I think there's been a little bit of progress in getting closer to parity, but we're still nowhere near close to parity. And so as a consequence, we have a pretty large unmet mental health need. One might assume then in the context of these disparities that if you have pronounced problems in underfunded services, the solution seems simple and straightforward. Let's fund those services, let's expand them, let's get providers out to people and services available and so on, right? Well, what I want to tell you about today is this lesson I had early on that I think complicates that proposed solution. Basically, in the late 1990s, on one of my very first research projects, I went home to the Fort Belknap Reservation to explore more in anthropological fashion, really. I wanted to hold at bay some of my own professional training and all that I was taught about how to think about mental health, and instead to proceed in more open-ended, discovery-oriented fashion to try and get a better sense for what people in my own community think of and how they make sense of the relationships between culture, drinking, and clinical depression. And so I interviewed members of an extended family and really ended up focusing in this early work on a case study with an individual who elected in our work to go by his Indian name, Traveling Thunder. A Traveling Thunder was a middle-aged, self-identified traditionalist, which is to say that he's someone who rejected Christianity and very much followed, the Indian religion is how it's described at home often. And was touched in many important ways by the Red Power movement of the 1970s to really look back. And what was interesting to me about Traveling Thunder is out of the people I interviewed, he was probably the least familiar with mental health services proper. And so his perspective was especially illuminating because he wasn't someone who had been socialized through his own participation into the work that so many of us as professionals do. And so I was interested to hear from him how he made sense of these relationships between culture, between drinking, between depression, and our community. And he offered what in anthropology we often refer to as an explanatory model. Explanatory model is basically how people themselves make sense of illness and disorder. And it's interesting and important because if you think about a cross-cultural clinical encounter, the physician brings an explanatory model, the patient brings an explanatory model, maybe the family brings an explanatory model. Those don't always line up or map onto each other. And so it can lead to miscommunication and different sets of assumptions and so on. In any case, with Traveling Thunder, with respect to these relationships, he really offered an explanatory model that referenced 4 historical eras. So let me walk you through these here. The first was an era based on his description that I labeled kind of paradise. It was really a description of pre-colonial existence for Indian people. Here's what he had to say about that. Quote, see, there was no alcohol in this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teachings. And there was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom. And so we see in his characterization of this in the paradise that there was really a perfect harmony and balance owing to really the strict observation of indigenous custom. That wasn't the last, of course. He talked about the next historical era, one dominated by colonial contact, what I would call conquest. In terms of characterizing his words, here's what he had to say about that. Quote, "But when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their way, their religious spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system on living off of the land, the wildlife, fish, and the herbal medicines. Then they turned around and forced their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them by taking all the young people out of the homes and putting them away in boarding schools and forcing the white man's teachings on them. It's genocide." So here you have a reference to a lot of facets of colonial subjugation, including a reference to the Indian industrial schools, which were kind of mandated to try to assimilate young people into mainstream society, albeit at the very lowest socioeconomic rungs. Didn't work that well. And as he said, it's genocide. So here, the key aspect I want to draw out is we're talking about subjugation in which that custom that kept things in harmony and balance was wiped out, according to him, or subjugated in deep, deep ways. So an annihilation of custom. Obviously, that's going to have consequences when that happens to your community. And so we have this third historical era he described, one of post-colonial effects that I labeled as loss based on how he talked about it. And here's what he had to say, quote, "If you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs and where you come from and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong because we don't fit in with the white man system. We never did and we never will. It basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from and what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things, alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression and you're going to not feel worthy of being a human being and you're going to want to kill yourself." So really here he's talking about what in psychology we refer to as anomie. It's kind of as a term that means no law, but in psychological sense, it means a loss of identity and purpose and who you are, where you belong, and what your life's supposed to do. In this case, he's tracing out anomie as in the wake of colonization leading to these forms of pathology. And in particular, then he's highlighting the so-called white man system as pathogenic. If you had to pick out where is the source of disorder, what is causal in terms of this disorder, it's the white man system as he referred to it. Fortunately, he didn't stop with this third era. He went on to talk about a fourth era, an era of revitalization since the Red Power movement of the 70s in particular, in which he held hope for kind of a post-colonial remedy of sorts. Quote, "After we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the creator, the spirit world, for life or for good health or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind. Or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance or for survival even survival. And so you have a sense of history here unfolding really in cyclical fashion, because now he's talking about going back to the very sacred custom tradition that he said kept things as a paradise prior to the whole incursion of Euro-Americans. So just in trying to summarize then Traveling Thunder's explanatory model based on these sorts of responses to our interview together, he identified a very clear pathological process. Again, it's in his actual words. It starts with a kind of repression of culture or these kinds of traditions and teachings that leads to a form of anomie that then leads to substance abuse, depression, worthlessness, suicide. Interestingly, he had very little to say about distress at kind of a personal or individual level. Moreover, he offered an account that was really non-biological or non-psychological even. He didn't talk about, genetic predispositions or brain chemistry. He didn't talk about early childhood or family dynamics. He emphasized instead history, culture, and spirituality. This was a historical account for where this came from. Moreover, he centered on the pathogenic aspects of the white man system. He identified colonization as the cause of indigenous distress. And in doing so, he emphasized systemic factors over intrapersonal factors. He's again not talking about individuals and what's wrong with a person and what's going on inside that person. It's really about the context. And he's emphasizing shared community vulnerabilities. This isn't this person or that person, it's what happened to us as peoples. And so I just want to call attention here to the way this intersects with what we now talk about as historical trauma. And I think it's a precursor in many respects to the way we talk about it today. There was one distinction, and we can maybe talk about this in the roundtable if you like. He didn't actually use the word trauma, and he didn't actually talk about psychology much. So that's one difference between all that he had to say in historical trauma. Historical trauma does feature this psychological side of things in a way that Traveling Thunder did not. Now, if you're like me, you kind of probably wondered in response to this disquisition on explanatory model of this sort, what is the relevance then of psychosocial interventions, mental health services, the kind of things that we often offer? So I asked him, I said, under what conditions then would you take a loved one who's going through a really tough time down to IHS clinic and, get some help from the people there? Well, he grew quiet in response to that. And he thought, soberly for a few, 10, 15 seconds. And then he responded as follows. Quote, I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out. Therefore, the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future, where the white man's leading you, I guess you can make a choice. Where do I want to end up? I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrists in the Indian Health Service and say, well, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make. Now, of course, he signaled clearly that this wasn't a choice that he himself would want to make. But here he's really clearly identifying, mental health treatment as a cross-cultural encounter, but not only a cross-cultural encounter, as actually an ideological interaction in which mental health services can be seen as a form of, neo-colonial cultural proselytization. And I'm using kind of like the language of religious conversion here on purpose. Sometimes when I want to provoke other Indian psychologists, I'll suggest that, Indian mental health professionals are like the missionaries for a new millennium in some respects, because of the way we try to promote in concert with modern ways of living. Well, getting back to my original question then, is maybe the answer is simply to expand mental health services to address inequities? Well, it's not that simple. And so we have in this audience, I don't have to go into detail here, we have the problem of cultural difference, which I kind of unpack here a little bit. Basically the norms, routines, and logics of the mental health clinic are not those of the Indigenous community. And they're not those of most communities in America, actually, except for maybe affluent suburban communities. But cultural difference can be navigated. People can come together and work out differences usually, but the problem here is it's not just the problem of cultural difference, it's also this problem of cultural dominance. That we have this legacy of colonial subjugation that touches every aspect of our lives. It was captured in the slogan of the industrial schools, which was kill the Indian, save the man. And there's still much sentiment of that sort that endures even to today. And the power asymmetries that gave rise to all this are now structured into place in ways that disadvantage our communities and our peoples in routine ways. So this all gives rise to what I've called the post-colonial predicament for mental health services in Indigenous communities, which is that on the one hand, we have pretty urgent community needs. We tend to live in impoverished, high-risk settings. We have these documented disparities in mental health status. But on the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer are just not only underfunded, they're actually incongruent for some swath of our population. Maybe we might think of traditionally oriented people or what have you. People like Traveling Thunder, who think that consulting a psychiatrist is an invitation to brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. And this is attested to, I think, not just by community anecdote, because you can hear this in different parts of Indian country, but by the research evidence, which has tried to systematically assess people's service preferences when they have mental health problems. So there in the Southwest, for example, the American Indian SuperFIP Psych-Epi project found that members of the population on that big reservation in the Southwest was more interested in getting consulting traditional healers for mental health problems than they were, medical professionals. Similarly, in the Great Lakes region, for epidemiologists going on with 8 different reservations and some reserves in Canada, found that if you rank order service preferences for people when they're going through mental health crisis, it's elders and family members and healers and things like that. The mental health people don't even show up till below 10, I think, in terms of the rank order of who they would want to consult. So this, as I said, set in motion in my career, attending to a really different approach to thinking about mental health stuff. And it's led me to pursue projects of various kinds that I don't have time to review today. But what I want to do is systematize what I've learned then over the past 25 years working with maybe 8 different communities. What I call an alternative science. And I'm using the term science here for a reason. Let me just tell you why. Science as in scientific inquiry and practices, activities, and findings of science have a lot of authority in our society. What Traveling Thunder is pointing out, of course, is that the professions that are often built on technological or technical scientific information and understandings, carry that authority as well, but they can have ideology associated with them that are not always in our interest. And the idea of the science and the sciences in this sense is that you're talking about psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, a whole set of modern ways of thinking about the human experience and how to help people who are in distress and so on, that came online with modernity and really emerged throughout the 20th century, and that have power and authority behind them and potential ideology. And so to call science in this sense is really calling attention to the historical contingency of these approaches and the fact that they, of course, like all modes of life, come and go, they ebb and flow, they are of their moment and time. And someday, somewhere, the sciences may not be nearly as compelling as they seem now. And so it's just calling attention to those contingent aspects of the work that we do and how we approach these issues. So in terms of an alternative science, I'm really talking about an Indigenous community mental health discourse that is distinct from, I think, but parallel to professional psychiatric discourse or mental health discourse. It's distinct from, parallel to, but contests and recasts, I think, key concepts and approaches in ways that I've heard all throughout Indian country. And so I just want to talk briefly about 4 domains and highlight some of these contrasts and contestations that I've observed. And I'll do so for the domains of distress, of well-being, of intervention, and of evaluation. And all of this can be unpacked in great detail, and there's not time for that today. So I'm just going to do a few highlights to just give you a flavor for what I'm talking about. So let's talk about distress first as a domain. I think when it comes to working with Indigenous advocates and gatekeepers and professionals in our own communities, the interest in what's really the problem and how do we manage distress is not really in DSM mental disorders of the kind that dominate the professional practice of people like us. These mental disorders in the DSM are pretty radically decontextualized. If you think about major depressive disorder or clinical depression, for example, they've even gotten rid of the bereavement exception these days, so that if you're experiencing grief and loss of a loved one, that no longer disqualifies you from experiencing being diagnosed with major depression. Substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, these are all just talked about completely abstracted out of their context in ways that doesn't resonate very well, I don't think, with Indigenous peoples. They're selectively incomplete in terms of what's classified in the DSM. So you're talking about post-colonial or colonial populations, where are the disorders of rage or of identity? Everywhere I go in Indian country, people link identity to the problems and this kind of anomie that Traveling Thunder talked about. But we don't have those kinds of things in a DSM. And there's measurement issues, of course. It's been difficult in the big psychiatry projects to really figure out, is it really true that depression is low in our communities or in other internalizing disorders, or is that a measurement artifact of some kind? So there's not that much interest in DSM disorders or in trying to refine, work these out, or contribute to them. Really, the interest is in, as Jalene kind of pointed out, historical trauma, which is a radically recontextualized way of trying to make sense of post-colonial distress. I think historical trauma is kind of recognizably a synthesis of 2 more familiar concepts, historical oppression and psychological trauma. You put these together as advocates and proponents have described this, starting with Maria Hauser-Brayport and, of course, Karina Walters and Tessa Evans-Campbell and lots of other people. I think you can see that they're what we call the 4 C's of historical trauma that help to differentiate it from, say, PTSD or personal trauma of some kind. It's colonial in origin, it's collectively experienced, it's cumulative across different kinds of adversity, and especially it's cross-generational. It's ancestors to offspring and descendants. And so again, it looks a lot, I think, like what Traveling Thunder was talking about, with the exception being that, again, Traveling Thunder was not very psychological. in his discussion of things. So this is in the domain of distress. I think there's a different way of reframing and recasting even how we think about distress. That's not how professionals typically think about it. And I think that's also true at the more implicit or tacit idea of this concept of well-being. Obviously, if you're working to help people cope with distress and restore their functioning and so on, you have at least embedded tacitly in that endeavor a sense of what good mental health would be. And we don't do a lot in our profession to really sketch out what we think good mental health and well-being might look like. But let me suggest here that, again, sort of tacitly, that our communities are not that interested in a kind of self-experience that we might characterize as neoliberal individualism. Which we can unpack as free agents navigating free markets in autonomous pursuit of happiness and wealth and so on. I think this is in part like the individualist American dream for a lot of people in our society, but I don't find that in the Indian country very often. Instead, I think what we're interested in are forms of indigenous relational selfhood, which are anchored first and foremost in kinship roles and obligations. Even your sense of identity is so tied to your family. Your sense of self really starts to expand beyond you as an organism, as with skin around your body, that it's expansive in this way. And it includes this responsibility. One thing about relational selfhood is it's about duties and roles in many respects. And so there's this responsibility, not just to your own human kin, but also to non-human relatives, whether that's, particular landscapes or whether that's spirit beings and so on. I think it also invites us to think about emotion in a really different way. We're used to thinking about Paul Ekman's, 6 basic universal human emotions that are examples of really decontextualized emotions. But in Indian country, I really recognize people talking much more about things that we might classify as social emotions. So pity and respect are huge. There are religious underpinnings to that in lots of our communities and in my own communities and communities on the Northern Plains. Pity or compassion is what spirit beings do when they look down on lowly humans in trouble and will help. And you owe those beings respect. So respect moves up the hierarchy, pity moves down. There's a whole system that's based on that. Love is huge, obviously. Loneliness, the anthropologist Teresa O'Neill talked about on the Salish Flathead, how clinical depression is talked about as loneliness. We talk in our communities about, insane jealousy. That's not something we really hear as a mental disorder. Pouting, hostility, suspicion, resentment, social emotions, I think, are one of the impacts of what this relational selfhood might require us to attend to as professionals instead of how we usually think in our professional training. So we've got distress, we've got well-being, and then we've got intervention. Treatment. And really, I don't find in too many of our communities all that much clamoring for the latest, greatest empirically supported treatments and evidence-based practice. In fact, I think there's suspicion about that. So, these kind of approaches obviously are cultivated through human ingenuity. How can we invent something that will really address what we formulate as the psychological issues at stake? How can we cultivate technical proficiency among the clinical workforce to really be able to deliver these? It's certified by a kind of distant and rarefied professional expertise underpinned with science, of course. It's that kind of technological aspect of things. And honestly, these are often quite dependent on psychological mindedness, which is the idea that one looks inward a lot, that one has a deep interior that's richly furnished, that one can tell a narrative of one's self journey. This is all part of modernity. And it's not, I don't think that Indian people can't do that. But I actually think that most people around the world, this is not necessarily their default modality, that kind of individualism that underpins a deep psychological mindedness. So what instead? Well, reclaim traditional healing practices is what I hear a lot about. Part of it's referenced by, again, Jalene, you talked about the culture as treatment. When I go places, I often hear advocates and gatekeepers saying things like, we don't really need the latest, greatest evidence-based practice. Our culture is our treatment. And this is a reference in large part to sacred and ceremonial practices that are mediated by ritual leaders involving prayer and petition of spirit beings. So it's really dependent on powerful non-humans who circulate blessings in life that, of course, drive out negative things like disability and poverty and those sorts of things. So I think there's just a really different, and it's really religious or spiritual often in many cases as to what the intervention ought to be. So we've got distress, well-being, intervention. The last domain I'll talk about is evaluation. Of course, when it comes to evaluating, what treatments work in our profession, we've got evidence-based practice, which depends on scientific outcome studies. Science as a technology has transformed the world in all kinds of wonderful ways. And of course, Indians fly on airplanes and drive cars and do all the stuff that technology can provide in that respect, talk on cell phones. But, there are some recognition of limitations. I mean, scientific inquiry and approaches can be seen as really extending rationality. It's kind of about the modality of rationality. You can almost think of science as a cognitive prosthesis that allows us to do more and better than we can off the top of our heads in terms of this kind of rational approach. It often presumes a kind of mechanistic materialism, that the world operates according to laws and principles, and all you need to really figure out are the mechanisms to really understand it. And of course, it adopts a kind of skepticism. All adoptions of skepticism are selective because you couldn't do anything if you were skeptical of everything. But in this case, it's a selective skepticism that, drives, prove it or show me, or I can't accept that without you telling me a lot more about why you think it's the case. This kind of scientific inquiry and modality of thinking, I think, is not what I find so much in Indigenous communities. Instead, I'm hearing people more and more talk about Indigenous ways of knowing. And when I've heard about this, I remember going to a gathering at the Blackfeet Crazy Dog Society, which is a kind of grassroots cultural society on the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. I was working with partners at the Addiction Treatment Center there. And, we wanted to get their help. I was working with a cultural counselor, so he took me out there. We were in this lodge. We waited till it was our turn. They invited us to speak. And I looked to Danny to ask them what we wanted. And Danny said to me, "Joe, go ahead and tell them." So, I fumbled and bumbled enough to sort of say, "Look, we were wanting to get your help on developing an alternative to, this kind of approach to addiction that would be founded on Blackfeet approaches. Because in the scientific world, we want to evaluate it, because in the scientific world, it's not yet known that, cultural participation and ceremonial stuff can remedy addiction." And with that, the lodge erupted in laughter. I mean, they just laughed for probably 15 or 20 seconds until it all calmed down, and the ceremonial leader explained, like you would to a child, every person in this lodge is living proof that cultural participation remedies addiction. I mean, it's just ridiculous that you would need to, demonstrate. Well, why? I think if you look at these Indigenous ways of knowing a bit, you find that narratively conveyed personal experience is really the highest authority for whether something is epistemologically compelling to you. And I think this in part undergirds also the commitment and interest in practice-based evidence rather than evidence-based practice, centering what people experience firsthand, because in some ways, in Indigenous ways of knowing, that's the best you can ever get. So just to tie it all together in terms of the summary of this Indigenous parapsychiatric framework or science, the problem is not mental disorders, but historical trauma. The aspiration is not neoliberal individualism, but relational selfhood. The interventions are not empirically supported treatments, but reclaimed healing practices. And evaluation of what works is not based so much on scientific studies, but Indigenous ways of knowing. So, I've written a lot about this and other kinds of stuff. In fact, I just drafted a manuscript that's under review now that will try to unpack all this in the way I've just done. That's not up yet, but it will be at some point. So anyway, I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to share this with you today in commemoration of Jalene's important prize and the work that you've been doing. So thanks so much for listening. And I'm excited at the roundtable to have more opportunity to talk about these issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe, Dr. Ghan. I always enjoy how you elevate Indigenous voices, the narrative, literally, Indigenous worldviews and perspectives to help us really improve our science, PSY. So I do also look forward to hearing more from you during our panel. And now it's my great honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karina Walters, who is an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, who's a Catherine Hall Chambers University professor at the University of Washington School of Social Work, an adjunct professor in the Department of Global Health, School of Public Health, and the founding director of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute at the University of Washington. She has over 25 years of experience in social epidemiological research on the environmental, historical, social, and cultural determinants of American Indian Alaska Native health and health equity, as well as experience in Indigenous methodologies and in designing culturally derived chronic disease prevention research. She's written landmark papers in the field of traumatic stress and health, developed culturally specific measures of historical trauma and microaggression distress, and developed the Indigenous stress coping model, which Jalene referenced, which has been cited in over 450 studies. Methodologically, she has expertise in decolonizing methodologies, particularly with respect to developing culturally grounded measures, as well as designing community-based culturally derived interventions. Dr. Walters has served as principal investigator or co-investigator on 33 NIH studies, 22 as PI from diverse NIH institutes. Recognizing her scientific practice and research talents, she's only one of 2 American Indians and the only Native woman ever invited to deliver the prestigious Director's Lecture to the Wednesday afternoon lecture series at the National Institute of Health, and is the first American Indian fellow inductee into the American Academy of Social Welfare and Social Work, where she co-chaired the Health Equity Committee. Dr. Walters earned her bachelor's in sociology, her master's of social work, and her PhD in social welfare, all from UCLA. So as accomplished as Dr. Walters is, she remains very humble, down to earth, and generous in her mentorship to help increase the number and rigor of Indigenous researchers. Because there's relatively few American Indian Alaska Native researchers of her stature, and because of her trailblazing work, Karina has been a great role model for me and others in academia. It's very helpful to see outstanding exemplars of scientists who look like us. I'm sure you'll be impacted by Dr. Walters' talk today. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this pronunciation right. Yapali Choctaw Road to Health, centering Indigenous methodologies for sustainable health promotion interventions. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Karina Walters.
Okay, thank you so much, Kamilla. I'm like honored to be here, and thank you to Dr. Sobel and Duncan for providing the opportunity for us to gather in this way. And congratulations, Jalene. It was wonderful listening to your presentation. And Joe, as always, I love listening to you. And I feel really honored and blessed to be able to go at the end, because I get to kind of tag on to some of the elements and ideas that both Jalene and Joe shared. I'm going to share my screen so I can get this going. There we go. You can see it okay? Okay, great. So just by way of introduction, I just want to say halito sa chifa hatupushi kantan spo chebete hoyo micha chata si hoke micha yakoke okla duamish micha yakoke okla snohomish and micha yakoke okla moma. Koyana, Jalene, for your work as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous land that I'm sitting in. I'm in the Snohomish and Duwamish territory here in Seattle, and I acknowledged all the territories that you all are on. And I'm just grateful to be here and to share today. I am going to share a little bit about my career trajectory as well, like Joe did, and a little bit of lessons learned. And I'm going to share it through the 4 elements, and I'll try to get through that way of thinking and highlighting some of the issues. And of course, historical trauma has been kind of a big area of work that I've developed and others have developed over the years. And I wanted to start a little bit before I launch into how that's evolved into the development of Yapali. I want us to think about water to set the context. And, you know, the earth is covered with water. Our bodies are mostly made of water. We're birthed from our mother's waters. Literally, this is why, you know, one of the many reasons why water is medicine. And what does water do? Water just goes up into the heavens to become clouds, and then it turns right back around and comes back down. So every time we take a sip of that water, we're touching the same water that our ancestors touched. And in that way, our lives are always connected every single day. So too, the kind of traumatic as well as the resiliency experiences that our ancestors experienced are also intimately connected to us every single day. So I want us to think about water when I'm talking about historical trauma. But more importantly, I actually, and Joe kind of set me up beautifully for this, I want us to think about not about historical trauma or the experiences of historically traumatic events as disempowering or creating a victim mindset. And certainly our Native communities are not to be defined by historical trauma, because we should be defined, as both Jalene and Joe highlighted, by our original instructions and the original understandings of who we are as a people, that's tied to our ancestral memory and practices and protocols. That's what defines us, not historically traumatic events. So when I talk about historical trauma, I don't want us to get confounded or confused that I'm talking about adopting or adapting to a victim mindset, because that's actually a settler colonial practice that folks would like us to have. So I'm not talking about it from that position. I'm actually talking about a position of incredible power. And when I talk about power, I mean about, in this moment, I am my great-great-grandmother's granddaughter. In this moment, I am my great-great-granddaughter's great-great-great-grandmother. In this moment, I'm all of those things. So if I take care of my wellness right now, I'm not just taking care of my wellness for me, as Joe talked about. It's not that neoliberal individualism. I'm actually also taking care of my wellness because I'm then caring for my family. But more importantly, I'm also taking action that has impact on future generations, the next 7 generations forward, some of our communities might say. But also, I have an opportunity to heal whatever didn't get healed 7 generations before, that is still maybe even carried epigenetically in me right now. In this moment, I have the opportunity to affect both forward and backward spatially and have tremendous impact. That is not a victim mentality at all. That is not about being disempowered. It's actually about having tremendous power. So I wanted to kind of put that out there. The other piece is vision. Our ancestors, my ancestors in particular, I descend from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. We were the first to be removed on the Trail of Tears. So what's known as the Trail of Tears. And so my ancestors did not go through that experience without having a vision of love and life for future generations that I have an obligation and responsibility to reconnect to and continue to live. So that vision is also part of understanding historical trauma. So I want to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. And then the final thing, and Joe said this, love. It's really all of this. When I talk about historical trauma, is actually about incredible love. The love that our ancestors carried for us as they walked on that trail, even generations before, when my ancestors first removed from our ancient homelands, when we went on a great journey, this was thousands of years ago, my ancestors carried all of the bones of their ancestors on their backs because they wouldn't leave the bones behind. That's how much they love me. And so if I continue to work on my health now, that's how much I love future generations and manifest that. So that's how I think about historical trauma and how I've come to think about historical trauma over time. It's really about power, vision, and love, and how do we reconnect to that in a way that's healing and moving us forward to transcend and go beyond this historical notion of even historical trauma. My early work focused on embodiment and how do these traumatic stressors and events become literally taken up in the body, both physical health-wise as well as mental and spiritual health. I'm not going to get too deep into that. Jalene already mentioned, so did Joe, Indigenous stress coping model, these traumatic events that have an impact on our well-being, historically traumatic events, and combined with everyday discriminatory events that we navigate and negotiate in our everyday lives. But as Jalene's work has shown and others, culture matters. And family, culture, language, all of these processes, Traveling Thunder remind us of that with Joe's presentation, that these serve as important protective factors that buffer the impact of these kinds of stressors that our communities have experienced. And that buffer helps to protect and promote our health and wellness. And when I talk about health and wellness, I'm like Joe's highlighted, I'm not talking about individual psychological minded wellness. I'm talking about land, relationship to land, body, spirit, and mental, all combined. One thing I've learned over the work on historical trauma is really the critical importance of really talking a little bit more about settler colonialism, because I think we throw around this word colonization as if we all understand it and agree on what we mean by it. And actually, and we haven't articulated very well in the literature how colonization really is connected to these and tied to historically traumatic events. We talk about them as being kind of one kind of big ball of something that has had an impact on our well-being. And why is this critical? And now I'm moving into that land component. So I went from water, now I'm into the land, is because it's tied to, our well-being is tied to the land. It's tied to land because land has been here since time memorial. We have ancestral ties to that land. We have protocols and ways of living that are tied to land-based understanding. There's a huge movement happening in Indigenous communities that are looking at land-based healing approaches. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that with our Iapoli project in a minute. But the fundamental difference is the different way we understand land. And how that ties to settler colonialism. So a good example is from almost around the world, Indigenous people will say or have a phrase that says something like, I am the land is me, that there's not the separation. And that's very different than a settler colonial point of view. It's certainly one that's on market capitalist economies, right? I own the land is mine, right? And so that fundamental difference makes a big difference in terms of how we think about healing and how we connect with land and body and space and place in terms of returning to well-being. So let me just articulate really quickly settler colonialism and historical trauma. Again, this hasn't really been thought about. I don't have time to go into great detail about it, but the way to think about it is US settler colonialism, it's different than colonialism in a classic sense because settlers came to stay. And it consists of the policies and practices and structures that facilitate native land dispossession. And part of that means their erasure of Indigenous people from land, right? And Patrick Wolf reminds us that settler colonialism is actually a structure. It's not an event. That's different than historically traumatic events. They are events. But settler colonialism is actually a structure. And these structures include policies and values that undergird those systems, right? So manifest destiny is an example of that, doctrine of discovery. And all of these structures and policies serve certain functions to distort historical realities, to free future settler generations from guilt and accountability, rationalize and normalize continuous settler rights to dispossess Native people of our lands, erase Indigenous people from land. So erasure is a big, big factor. And Traveling Thunder kind of highlighted that too, Joe, in his conversation with you, right? So if we can erase Indigenous people from the land, then settler folks can then create stories about relationship to land and place that perpetuates the right to continue to occupy in ways, but more importantly, disavow the violence that on which it was founded or the ongoing violence that still continues today. And why does that matter? I love Eve Tuck says this really beautifully. She says, well, every colonial society strains to destroy or assimilate the native in order to disappear them from the land. This is how a society can have multiple simultaneous and conflicting messages about Indigenous people, such as all Indians are dead, or we're located in faraway reservations, or that contemporary Indigenous people are less Indigenous than prior generations, and that all Americans are just a little bit Indian. That's why we can have these kind of mythologies that continue to reassert themselves. So how does that tie to historically traumatic events? Those are the structures that are in place to try to erase indigeneity. Well, historically traumatic events are the events that uphold those structures. That these are the events that uphold these value systems. And this is a little bit different because Joe talked about historical trauma a little bit more in terms of the impact. I'm talking about the actual events that are designed to uphold and erase Indigenous people in some way, shape, or form. So to me, that's what historically traumatic events are. These are events that are designed to do three things: eradicate a people, either that could be genocide, right? Straight up genocide, or about eradicating lifeways, what I would call ethnocide, right? It's a form of genocide if we look at the UN definition. And that is the systematic destruction of culture, language, and lifeways, or eradicate thoughtways, right? The systematic destruction of worldviews, knowledges, and epistemologies, epistemicide. So these three things are part of what constitutes historically traumatic events. And even despite our communities having those kinds of experiences, we're still here and we've been incredibly resilient. So I want to acknowledge that as well. But just to give a head nod to what I'm talking about, like boarding school experience, Indian residential schools that Joe mentioned are a great example of a major historically traumatic event that impacted thousands of children across the continent. Where children were taken away and put into these boarding schools with the intent to erase their indigeneity. So that's the form of ethnocide I was talking about. And here's an example from our local communities out here in Spokane. Research for my career saying, yes, I think these historically traumatic events still persist. And even looking at controlling for lifetime exposure to different kinds of traumatic events, sexual trauma, physical trauma, and even one's own exposure to historically traumatic events, even after controlling for that statistically, can we still see an effect of what happened 2 or 3 generations ago on people's mental health? And some of our early work and work shows, yes, you can still see some of the impact still continues to persist in the form of PTSD and also in terms of substance use. So turning to the lessons learned from this early work to this phase of my career is that historical trauma events are designed to disrupt our ability to fulfill our original instructions. You know, when General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Lakota is to kill the buffalo, he wasn't talking about interrupting a food source. He was talking about disrupting a people's ability to fulfill their original instructions and teachings to Buffalo, the Buffalo Nation. It's a much more spiritual assault than subsistence assault. So disruption, historically traumatic events function to uphold the settler colonialism, and they function to disrupt our ability to fulfill our original instructions. They disrupt our relational ways of being in the world. That's what Traveling Thunder was talking about. And they disrupt how we story our lives, how we talk and think about ourselves if we internalize some of these processes. And so to move forward, how do we address that? This is where the work has gone for me in terms of trying to design interventions that really look at developing health promotion interventions. And for me, that consists of those 3 elements. The first is we have to restore, or we grow and regenerate or continue to generate interventions based on our original teachings, our original instructions. And they're still there in many of our communities. And I don't, even if we have our land and we have our water and we have our mountains and we have these elements, our stories are still present and still unfolding. So we have original teachings that we can still connect to. Give you a quick example of one. In my own tribe, we have a story about Hashkanaya, the moon. And this story came up when we were doing an intervention with our Yapili Native women. And I'll tell you the comic book version of it. Hashkanaya lives up in the sky. And in ancient times, she lived with Hashtali, the sun. And they were lovers. They loved each other, and their children were the star people, all the star children. And they shared the day sky together. So there was just always sunshine. It was always beautiful, and they shared the sky world together. But you know how the sun sometimes can be. Sometimes they have their little flares, their solar flares, they flare out. And so Hashkanaya turned to Hashtali and she said, if any of your solar flares ever hits me, I will take the children, star children, and we will move away. And he said, oh, no, that will never happen. And she says, well, I'm just telling you, that's how this has to be if we're sharing the sky together. And then one day that happened. Hashtali got upset and he threw a flare and it hit Hashkanaya. Hashkanaya immediately said, I'm sorry, I need to leave now. I'm going to take all the star children and we're going to the other side of the world. And that's how the dark world came into being with all the star children. Hashtali begged for her back and she said, no, that was our understanding. I love you, but this is what I must do to protect my children and protect myself. So that's what we are doing. But I recognize that we still love each other. So we'll meet once a month and we'll share the morning sky daylight together for a little conversation so we can visit, but that's it. So that's our comic book version story of, I'm telling you, of Hashkanaya. What that tells me is we already had original teachings about domestic violence prevention from the beginning. We already had an understanding of how to respect each other, and if that respect is violated, what the consequences would be. So that's an example of how you can garner these original instructions through and bring them into our health promotion interventions. The other one is relational restoration is the second element for creating culturally based interventions. We want to grow and restore a relational way of being, right? Because we already know that historical trauma is trying to disrupt our relational way of being, whether it's to our land, literally land dispossession, or it's even to our teachings. That's a relational interruption if we don't even have access to some of those teachings, even down to psychology, right? If we're taught that we are our disease, right, then it makes it very difficult to deal with, as opposed to saying we're dealing with dis-ease, out of balance, being out of balance, or this issue of, like, for example, depression. You know, we have a relationship to depression is very different than saying I am always depressed. If you have a relationship to depression, you can put some boundaries and set relational ways of being with this depression. When does it visit you? Does it visit you at 3 o'clock in the morning and wake up? Does it telling you negative things? You know, if you have a relational way of understanding depression, you can have some opportunity to do something and connect with it. And why is this important? Is because the relational way of thinking, and especially for colonization, settler colonialism requires dependency as part of its maintaining its core. And we can even do that at the clinical level, right? If we've taught someone to be a really good patient over a system in a very long time, sometimes people learn to be very dependent on the system and stop engaging in doing that kind of engaged work. But from a traditional point of view or a relational point of view, people would say, well, the only way any medicine is going to work, whether it's traditional medicine or even psychological medicine in modern times, is that you have to meet the medicine halfway. That we are not passive recipients in our world from an Indigenous point of view, but that we actually have a relational way of relating to any kind of medicine, that we have to meet that medicine halfway. Our holy men and women don't go up and have a fast and do their thing and say, okay, creator, tell me tell me what I just need to know, right? They actually have to go and meet the spirit world halfway to see if they can even access that knowledge or even be connected to that knowledge. So meeting the medicine halfway is a way of thinking, bringing our relational way of being back into our interventions. And that's actually really critical for being truly empowered and moving things forward. And the third element in any intervention design is narrative transformation. How we talk and think, talk our story really matters, right? And why is this important? Because there are sometimes things that we call cultural, when in fact, sometimes they are historically traumatic responses that are coping strategies that worked in one generation that continues to manifest in the current generation, and it may not be working anymore, right? So if in one generation, there was a great famine that hit a community and that people overfed at key moments in time because it was a way to cope with that crisis, in this generation, that may not be working anymore. And it can be actually problematic. But the problem is we start calling sometimes these things cultural when they're actually historically traumatic responses. So we need to kind of begin to disentangle some of that in developing interventions that are really helpful for our communities. So for me, decolonization is not a metaphor, as Eve Tuck talks about it. She's highlighted that. Decolonization really is about incorporating these Indigenous knowledges like Joe was talking about, and as Leanne Simpson says, our Indigenous intelligence, and that we must find ways of reinserting people into relationships and relationship to the land as a mode of education and healing. And so I'm going to share a little bit with you in my remaining time about Yawpali and how I got to this kind of transformation myself. And I'm not talking about taking evidence-based interventions and basically tagging a feather onto it and calling it an Indigenous piece. You know, I think Grossman says it really well. Scientists can't just take Western structures of knowledge and add Indigenous and stir. and expect a perfectly synthesized way of knowing and doing. Our Indigenous knowledges have to be, for me, centered first and foremost, and that we then, out of that, begin to look at other knowledges and practices that can be brought in on our terms that might be helpful. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, you know, in the old days when new technology came into our community or someone brought new medicines, and we always shared, right? We had great waterways and great roadways where we shared knowledges, but it would be on our terms. And so you can imagine, you know, someone coming in and bringing in some new goods in the community. All the grandmas, you know, they were all there. They all went to go look at this new thing that came into town and say, oh, I'll take that, or no, I don't want that. So it's not the newness that is a bad thing, but what could be a bad thing is the terms on which that newness is brought in. Is it on our terms? Is it something that's going to be helpful or beneficial? So that's the way I look at it. I don't have a problem bringing in Western knowledges if they're going to be helpful and supportive to our communities, but it has to be on our terms if we're centering it from our Indigenous perspectives first and foremost. Okay, so the transformative moment for me to move from focusing so much of the early career on just establishing historical trauma events as something that still has an impact on our well-being to, well, how do we transcend it? How do we begin to think and bust out of this? And I have to tell you, I heard a story from a Native Hawaiian elder, and I just had my aha moment when he was sharing this story. And it made me realize how I had become so narrow in thinking. And it's easy to do when you get really immersed in a particular area that you're working in as a scholar. And so he used this example of crabs in a bucket. And you know, have you ever heard that phrase before, crabs in a bucket? You know, it's the fishermen will put crabs in a bucket because when a crab tries to crawl out, the other crabs pull it back down. So it's used quite often as a metaphor for lateral violence that we do to ourselves. As soon as someone tries to crawl out, others bring someone else back down. And so he turned to us and he said, you know, that's really bad crab behavior, isn't it? And we're like, yeah, that's really, you know, those crabs in a bucket, you know, crabs will do that. And then he said, do crabs live in a bucket? And I was like, no, crabs don't live in a bucket. He asked a very simple question. Do crabs live in a bucket? And I started thinking, oh my God, I'm a crab. I'm a crab in a bucket myself, and my bucket is historical trauma. And I'm like the crab in the bucket going, come on, other crabs, we can get through this. Let's lift each other up out of this bucket. But I failed to look at the bucket. And he said, no, crabs, what do crabs do? Crabs in their natural environment, they actually lift each other up on rocks. They actually help each other up. Now, I'm sure there's a few bad crabs out there that will knock a crab down once in a while, but crab behavior, when it's in its healthful environment, is lifting each other up. He said, and then that's when I realized, when did I accept our behavior, our crab behavior, as a way to define it? That really when we create our interventions, we got to bust out of our bucket. We have to imagine our life without the bucket. And to me, that was very freeing. And that what that really told me is that we have to create an environment, interventions that are sustainable about changing, not the psychology or just individual behaviors, but the environment, so that healthful behaviors that are natural to human beings and natural to our systems emerge. And that was a big shift for me. So how am I doing on time? Do I have a few more minutes, Kamilla? 5?
I think maybe take a couple.
Okay, just a couple of minutes just to turn to the final point, is that we were able to do this with the development of Yawpali. And I was very excited to be asked and invited by my tribe to come in to do this work. And I also was able to bring in Dr. Michelle Johnson-Jennings, who's also another Choctaw scholar, to help develop this project as well. And, you know, we were the first to be removed on the Trail of Tears. So historical trauma is behind our people, because literally we're a tribe because we're the survivors and descendants of those who had been removed from the Trail of Tears. And I was asked, and Sandy Stroud is also our project director, so I'm going to acknowledge her. We were removed. This is our removal route from Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi to but is now southeastern Oklahoma. And just to give you an idea, we still use traditional words for our land base in southeastern Oklahoma. We're now a reservation, according to law. So our tribe asked us very quickly to come in and ask me, he said, you know, we're dealing with really high rates of obesity. We're dealing with high rates of diabetes. By 2050, you know, 2 out of 3 of our kids may be living with diabetes and type 2 diabetes. I'm like, wow, that is crazy. That is really bad. And he said, we're in a condition where our parents will outlive their children. And so that we need to turn this bus around. How do we do that? And I said, well, what do you think's happening? He said, there's like, we're doing everything right. We're doing everything by Western and behavioral medicine correctly. We've employed the best psychological interventions. We've done the best surgeries. We have the best diabetes clinics and trying to change diets. We have the best walking paths now that we've put in. We've done structural all the way down to individual change, and the needle is not moving. It's not moving at a fast enough rate for us to do something different. So he said, can we do something that's more culturally focused? We need to shift something. I said, well, what do you think it is? He said, there's this deep sadness. We can't, there's something there. And he said, basically, you know, we've got these great gyms. The 30% of the people who come into services are getting healthier. They are improving. It's the 70% that's driving the population health issues that will not come in the door. And those are the folks we need to connect with and need to do something. And so basically we went out and I said, let me pray about it. That was not a normal way to approach this because you're doing everything empirically right. And it came to me very simply. Our ancestors did not walk that trail of tears to be dying the way we're dying. They walked with a vision of love and life for us. How do we reconnect to that vision of love and life for ourselves? How do we do that? And Sharon Fleming, who is the chief sister, had a women's project, and she and I worked together on trying to come up with a solution with us, and Dr. Michelle Johnson Jennings as well. And we basically proposed, let's rewalk the Trail of Tears to create our own Choctaw health promotion model that we as researchers and community members will rewalk the Trail of Tears in 2 sets of pilots to actually come up with our own Choctaw paradigm of understanding how to move forward and create a Choctaw health promotion model. And so we did. And I'm just closing with this because I don't have time. But we worked with elders. We did ceremony. We approached the trail relationally. We did qualitative research as well as quantitative research. We served as our own subjects for the 15 of us who went out on the first trail. We used Choctaw principles to guide our work. And we literally fasted and did all kinds of things in preparation to go to land. From a traditional perspective, we didn't expect we would have some great knowledge come down from us. We had to earn it. And hopefully something would arise to help us to understand relationally how to move forward and develop a Choctaw health promotion model. We felt being on the land was critical to beginning to do that model. Here's some pictures of the Trail of Tears. And so we set forth to do that. And some of the themes that came up is the importance of restoring our trauma, building from our original instructions, the importance of reconnecting to the trail, not to get into the drama of the trauma, but to realign ourselves with the vision of love and ancestors and recommit ourselves to that vision of love and ancestors. Out of that, we created a Choctaw specific curriculum and health promotion approach that was based on our ancient clan systems to guide behavioral change all the way to community change. And we did borrow a little bit from IMB to explain this to the world, the Western world, to understand a little bit of our framework that what's going to motivate change for behavior is going to be connecting directly to original instructions and relational ways of being. So we flipped the script. This wasn't about looking at suicide prevention. Instead, we were saying, well, what is our original teachings about? What are our original teachings around life and living? It's not substance abuse prevention. It's about what are our original teachings about medicine. And when we get out of balance with medicine, the natural consequences, and how do we recover from that? What are our teachings about that? So we flipped the script to create a health promotion model with a goal of building community-based health leaders. So this isn't about an obesity, substance abuse prevention, because those are the 2 issues that the community want us to look at. This was about creating community-based health leaders based on our ancient clan systems who set forth their own goals with a vision of what kind of great ancestor do they want to be for future generations? What kind of ancestor are they being in healing past generations? And we actually teach them and work with them about developing community organizing skills to hold health prevention promotion events at the local community level. And so that's our project. We're in our final year. And these are our guiding questions. What kind of ancestor did my ancestors envision me to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to be? What kind of ancestor do I want or envision future generations to be, but through my actions today? And so we'll have 150 Choctaw women health leaders at the community level who are poised to be responsive to any kind of events, like if there's a substance abuse overdose, White Crane women would all gather other White Crane women together to respond at the community level. They don't get paid. It's what people do to reassert their cultural sovereignty and sustainability as a community. So that's it. Thank you, Yakoke, for allowing me to share that today.
Wow. Janan, Karina, thank you so much. I want to express my deep respect and gratitude to all of our speakers today, starting with Ms. Jalene Herron, Drs. Joe Ghan, and Drs. Karina Walters. Really giving voice again to Indigenous knowledge and science and what it means to us as Indigenous people and what Western science really can learn and how Western science can grow to better meet the needs to promote Indigenous health. I'm realizing this has been going long, so if you need to take a break, please feel free and come back and join us as quickly as you can. I don't want to take any more time away from our panelists, so I'm just going to try to jump right in, if that's okay. And gosh, there's so many questions. I know we won't have time to get to all of my questions either, but and I didn't notice if there were any questions coming in through the chat. So, so I'll just get started here. And I wanted to start with Jalene. Each of you have talked a little bit about the Indigenous health inequities that we're experiencing. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing with us some of your thoughts or just distilling some of the thoughts around why do these inequities exist?
Starting with the biggest question there is. I think there's so many different ways to answer this question, and I think I'll sort of lean on my policy background. So I think when you take a look at American Indian, Alaska Native policy going back to, early states of American history, when you look at American Indian policy, it's designed to terminate American Indian land and American Indian people, and if not, to assimilate American Indian people into mainstream white society. So I think when you look at policy that impacts health outcomes, right, when we think on a structural level, termination acts that encourage tribes to give up tribal sovereignty, relocation efforts that encouraged American Indian people to move into urban areas and off of tribal land so it could go to individual private ownership. I think those things have an effect on our people on wellness and limit access to cultural ways of knowing and cultural means of wellness and cultural means of healing. I think both Dr. Ghan and Dr. Walters really highlighted this, that Indigenous health is all relational. It's all in relation to the land, and our teachings are so tied to the land sometimes. And when you remove that accessibility, it makes sense that, health declines, whether that's mental health or physical health. It makes sense that these two things, this land and our wellness, are really interconnected. So when that's destroyed for generations, it's going to have downstream effects on individual well-being. So I think that's just one way to explain why health disparities exist. But that's kind of my conceptualization.
Thank you. That's excellent. And taking a big question and taking a big view of it, I think, is very important. And I think brings up a lot of issues around our science also that maybe we can get to about why doesn't our research more directly link to policy? Let's see. I don't actually know, Joe, since Karina was just talking, do you want to share some of your thoughts on why Indigenous inequities exist? Drives home some points.
Yeah, I don't have so much more to add from a kind of traveling thunder or historical trauma sort of explanation. I mean, it seems really, really clear that these kinds of crippling inequities that are shared by communities across Indigenous America come in the wake of colonization and various forms of colonial subjugation. Now we're talking at high orders of abstraction to say colonization, that touches down in all kinds of ways, some of which are shared across nearly all Native communities and some of which are pretty distinctive to certain ones. And of course, we've got different timescales going on. So I think what you want to do is to try to describe at a more fine-grained level of analysis for particular communities, particular settings, because otherwise the higher order of abstraction, which can be useful, but at the same time, it ends up being vague and maybe not applicable in concrete ways to everyone. So, because in part this has to do with questions of history. So I guess my response to it in part would have to do with the benefit of interdisciplinary explorations. I've been involved in Native American and Indigenous studies since I was a graduate student. It became formulated, coalesced around this Native American Indigenous Studies Association, or NISA, about 15 years ago when it was first getting going. And now there's an annual meeting of Indigenous scholars from all over the world, actually. And that's a place where you can see a lot of historians and a lot of, it's very inter and multidisciplinary. And so you can have windows of scholarly inquiry into all kinds of facets of these aspects. Obviously, settler colonialism and the way that we tend to have inherited it in the social sciences and in the health professions, comes through that typically. I mean, Patrick Wolf, of course, but then it gets percolated, and whether it's Eve Tuck or lots of other people, it's become, a key point of making sense of Indigenous experiences through NISA and NISA's members. So I just think there's ways that, there's only so much time in a day, and we all have our own expertise and we've got our own projects to do, but obviously these ideas circulate, they swirl, they percolate, and we pick them up and we harness them. And then they go out of fashion. You need a new idea, you need a new term, and you need a way to make it fresh again and to make it compelling. So it's just interesting in terms of how all of this circulates and swirls, I think, too.
Kamilla, can I just add to what you just said? I think one of the areas that is really, we could really look at is the settings in which people work, play, school, pray. These out and including land-based settings are key areas of place where we can begin to develop interventions and look at it. Because these settings are critical to people's well-being. When I think about the bucket, that it's the setting, it's the environment in which choices could be made or not made. And certainly the structural factors, whether it's poverty and, poor housing, and, there's a lot of real lived factors that are driving Indigenous health inequities that are, and poverty is one of the major ones, and poor housing is another one. Inadequate healthcare is another one. So, I mean, we've got a lot of layers that are really lived experiences that isn't about individual behavior at all. So if we begin to think about how do we look at settings where these disparities can take root and grow, and we can actually look at doing interventions within settings and having settings being a major factor for the intervention process, I think that's another avenue, or an avenue that we haven't really explored as well. And I know in psychology, they're starting to do some really interesting stuff on nature-based wellness and looking at the relationship to land and being. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to capitalize on some of those areas.
Oh my goodness, you guys have said so much. My head is exploding right now. We're talking about team science, interdisciplinary, which is something that this ship is promoting as well, working together, learning together. Joe, when you were talking about drilling down into the specific communities, I think that's such an important point, because I don't think we really talked about the American Indian, Alaska Natives are not like one homogeneous group, right? We didn't really make that point, although I know we all know that point. There's so many tribes, and within tribes, there can be so many differences. And I like how you are talking now, Karina, because we haven't really talked about, most of our interventions are more at an individual level, or even talking about culture. How do we bring it all together? How do we bring in historical traumatic events? How do we bring in social determinants of health that you were just speaking to, which I really appreciate? And how do we bring in other social factors that are going on, like discrimination and racism that Jalene had mentioned also. So I don't know if any of you have something more to say about this idea of how to bring in some more of these social determinants of health into our work, whether it's measurement or intervention, prevention.
I mean, I could just say that I think one way, you know, what Professor Walters just talked about, which was this amazing intervention that's completely outside of the box, but tied to a long history, legacy, has language that completely transforms the nature of the problem and what the solution might be and how people can work together. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I get most excited about, because they are contesting or reframing the legacy of the health professions and the health sciences that we are probably all socialized into. If you're in clinical psychology now, we're a health service profession, health services psychologist is what we're called now. It's very medicalized. And within the biomedical system, it's individualized. You know, it means tinkering with patients and helping patients recover to the status quo. So I just think it's really about inverting and reversing a lot of that medicalizing frame of reference to really talk about the things that have mattered to our peoples and our sources of healing and restoration that aren't about what clinicians are trained to do. So I really appreciated that.
That is beautiful. And that's the first time I've heard of all of that part of your work, Karina. It's very exciting.
I'm loving it. I have to tell you, from my position, it's exciting, and it's not an either or enterprise. I think part of settler colonialism is to get us to think totally always in binaries, and it's not either or. You're Indigenous or you're Western. It's more about thinking about different tools and how you relate to these tools, which matters. Again, thinking in that relational way. I would say that whatever interventions we do, at least those three elements, the original instructions, building from there, your original teachings, building relational ways of health and well-being, a relational worldview, restoring and regenerating that, and then really talking about how does that impact how we think and talk about ourselves, how that really matters. So for the women in Neapolis, the key thing was there was a real aha moment. I'll give you an example. There was one woman who had been struggling with back pain her whole life, was addicted to pain meds. She got sober shortly before coming out with us on the walk. And it was actually being in the land and on the walk that she kind of had this real aha moment. And it was getting outside of our, you know, it's not a 50-minute session inside a door, inside four walls. It was actually being out on the land and being in the footsteps of her grandmothers, that she had this visceral embodied connection to her ancestors and what they went through for her to have life. And it was then that she said, I'm getting off the pity party. What am I doing? And it wasn't a psychological process. They all talked about it as being an embodied. It was literally an embodied process. And she's been sober for over 5 years now. And she says it was literally being on that trail and then just realizing I want to be a different ancestor. And what we did is we actually did a naming ceremony too. So she received a name for her adult self now. And even that gave her a way of being in the world that was no longer defined by her illness or defined by how Western systems had already seen her. So I think those are the kinds of things, like we call it flipping the script of how we've been socialized to think about this, to really move things forward in a more exciting way. So
it's so exciting. I'm just thinking that Joe was talking about anomie, and that really directly speaks to that what was her purpose? She found a new purpose, and it wasn't individually focused, right? It's her connection to her people, like you were saying, past and future. Joe, are you unmuting to add right here?
No, but I could add quickly, which is to say that, I mentioned working with addiction treatment and Blackfeet, and we approached the Crazy Dog Society for help. We did get their help, and they did orchestrate an alternative Blackfeet approach to addiction treatment. And just to know, even when it's in a frame of like treatment for, mental disorder or for a problem, what they came up with looks nothing like treatment. It looks like participation in culture and ceremony, and even throughout the piloting the program, people said like, this shouldn't be labeled treatment. Anyone in Blackfeet who had an interest in these things would benefit from participating in a program like this. So it loses its kind of medicalized character, I think, when you let and work with partners who have ideas about what the therapeutic can look like, especially when they're more traditionally oriented. So I think that's just an important point to underscore, is even in the frame, if you let people take it where they think the therapeutic action happens with a more traditionalist approach, it doesn't look like psychosocial services. It looks like cultural and religious participation.
Wow. So, wow. And I'm noticing there's something in the chat that I'm not sure that I can really process in this moment, but I'll try to get back to it in just a moment. I feel like this brings us into another realm though. So what can we tell medical providers and psychologists and social services, human services folks? What can you do as we think about this culturally tailoring some of our evidence-based practices versus cultural centering or culturally grounded works, and taking into account that, we're not a homogeneous people. There's some very acculturated people, so, and of course, bicultural and very traditional. So I wonder what we can tell some of our folks here that are stuck in an office in these systems, what can they do? What advice do you have? And I don't know who would like to take that first. Jalene, you haven't spoken, so I just want to give you a chance to jump in. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really I think the best person to answer this. But I think, I think it's a tough question, right? Because it's hard with providers, right, to have so much information that doesn't rely on stereotypes, right? I think that's something that, like, I'm a huge advocate for culturally grounded interventions. I think that's the way of interventions for Native people for the future. But sometimes I don't want IHS to be like prescribing ceremonies. Like, I don't think that's the way.
Yeah.
And, and I don't know if that's the role of, like, I see clients, I'm a therapist. I don't know if I would suggest that, right? Because there's a role there. I think within this system, I'm still operating as a Western provider, even though I'm a Native person. And so I think, there's some work, I think Teresa LaFrambois's work about like reinvigorating our communities to have community sources, right? Like, and so encouraging clients to maybe seek out and learn about the opportunities available in their communities for relational healing aspects to the land. I don't think that necessarily Western providers should be providing a form of culture as care. I think that should come from communities, and that's the community's role. So I guess I wouldn't know what to say, because I think, and Dr. Ghan pointed this out, like, there's such a disconnect between Western psychology and traditional sort of lenses, traditional knowledge, that I think they can be integrated sometimes, but it's really challenging. And I don't think there's a right way. And even as a Native person in this realm, I can't, provide the one right answer for a Western provider. But culture is important. We should be talking about it with our clients, even if we can't be an authority, we can't be a provider in a cultural way.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that was really well said. I think that we've got even in our own communities, we have decolonizing work to do too. So I mean, I wouldn't assume that when we first were talking with Choctaw about this, people were like, great, we'll get service providers, and and actually it's the service providers who stepped up to do the work, by the way, to go on the trail. So they said, if we're going to ask clients to do something like this, we need to have this experience. But we were very clear that this wasn't about building a service, and that this was about building community sustainability. But we can actually incorporate behavioral health into that process. And it was about asking the right questions to shift people's thinking. And so they were like, wait, what? I said, well, it's not about importing culture into service. That services are important. There are Band-Aids. They're the immediate places we may need to have immediate attention because we're in crisis. But to have sustainable change, to really get at population health inequities, we need to do something that's at a much more systemic cultural piece. So I totally agree with Jalene. It's not about prescribing, I don't want Western practitioners to try to run sweat lodges or something. I'm not interested in that. But I would want people to begin to ask the right questions. What kind of ancestor do you see yourself?
Can I make a statement?
Yourself to be?
I kind of think that maybe you guys are misreading what I'm saying in the chat. I'm not saying that Western providers should provide a ceremony or a cultural experience to people. I think that they need to know how to refer people to these things, and that is a billable expense. So that would make practitioners want to do it, so they can be like, I know about this program, and I hear you're having this problem. And then they bill for their 15 minutes of saying, I've heard of this, and that's it.
Yeah, I wasn't actually responding to yours, but I was just saying in general, that was our experience, just so you know. And Canada actually has really clear connection to traditional healers and providers that people can go see.
It's really amazing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But I do like I think there's a way that, and there's an importance for Western models that are in especially certain crisis situations. And again, it's about the tool. Does the tool, how are we relating to that tool? Is it going to, how you relate to it matters if you're going to be the witch or the healer under certain circumstances. It could be oppressive or it could be liberatory. So to me, it's not an either or. It's about the context and then expanding.
Yes.
And how do we move forward in a way that's going to be helpful? Really about serving and developing and addressing population health, not just individual health.
And I concur with all of that too, in the sense that I think there's enough work to be done that, and so few people doing it in responsible and innovative and community engaged ways, that there's plenty of places to make important contributions. So the contingency management intervention and RCT, the tribal community, I mean, that's impressive as all hell. And I just think that work is super important because we do need to know things like, well, hey, actually treatment as usual in some Indian addiction programs is pretty good. I mean, it's working, it's helping. That's good. We didn't really know that. And we need to know that kind of thing. And we need to know that if you put a bunch of resources and effort to try to tinker with this and make it work a little better, does it necessarily make it, maybe we don't need to invest those resources in some settings, depending on those details. So it's all important. I do think though, as Professor Venner has heard me say from time to time, the ills of Indian country aren't going to be solved by more mental health services or better mental health services or any health services. Our problems are not really properly addressed in the big picture scheme of things through health care. I mean, it's not that we don't have, as Professor Walters said, we have crises and we need those kinds of services, but we can't count on them to transform in the way that we need to be transformed. And part of it's all that structural stuff that's really, really, really hard to undo. And some of it's never going to get better until that stuff can be undone. But there are things we can be doing outside of healthcare that don't entail necessarily revolutionizing all of the structural inequities that can make a difference too. And I think it's in that between place where we're not hopeless in the face of all this structural stuff that no one knows how to change. And also we're not only medicalized as if that's the real answer. It's in that broader space that encompasses it all, but recognizes that middle ground. And that middle ground is harder to fund. So, I think what Professor Walters has done is got NIH funding to do this really amazing thing. I mean, anyway, it's a precedent we all need. It's hopeful in some respects. At the same time, that we can't really rely on the U.S. government to fund the revolution.
That's awesome. So we can continue talking about this as well, because I think I agree that we need every kind of level of ideas and resources and interventions possible, because everybody's different, everybody's at a different stage, and no one area is going to do it all. Gosh. Anyway, so I guess I wanted to kind of capitalize on what you were just talking about, Joe, because I know you and Karina have worked to develop more culturally grounded interventions. And I would like to hear more from Karina, how she got that funded. But Joe, I know you've had some trouble getting it funded. So I'm wondering what you think about, you know, the communities know it works, but kind of Western science or, you know, our disciplines or, you know, kind of want more Western science sort of data or proof. So what's going on there? Why are we having trouble, a lot of us, getting funding for that kind of work, and what can be done or what should be done?
You know, I remember Spiro Manson once telling me earlier in my career that, you know, science is conservative. And, you know, that's very true. I think, you know, it's you bring a healthy dose of skepticism within a scientific style of reasoning. That means that, you know, steps have to be quite incremental. It's slow progress. It does change, and things do become possible that weren't possible 20 years ago or 15 years ago. So it's always evolving like the rest of society and culture and so on, but probably slower in some respects than other kinds of domains. And in that respect, I think that, you know, it depends on the degree to which you are dependent on that kind of funding to do the work you want to do that will help to constrain. And that's one thing that all professionals, maybe for Jalene and for others on here who are thinking about moving on into the world, your activities and your life will be, your contributions to this domain will be utterly dependent on who's paying for what you're doing. You know, and the ability to get what you want to do paid for somehow, some way is key to being able to. So a lot of us in these kinds of institutions are hobbled to NIH or to NSF in a way with conservative science dominating it, that it's really, really hard to like step more deeply into more alternative, more radical, more widely renovated kinds of approaches. I think I was very fortunate in my career at Michigan, which is a big university that had a lot of money floating around, and my projects were not that expensive, you know, that the Blackfeet and I could work together with some money I could contribute, some money they could get locally to pilot this kind of alternative thing. Now, piloting is one thing. I mean, they actually used their own money to offer it a couple summers in a row afterwards with innovations and renovations they wanted, but there really wasn't money to evaluate it. So there's limitations as to what you can do with small pots of money. And our colleagues would love, and Indian country would love to see, you know, cultural and ceremonial, well, cultural practices, let's say, I don't know about ceremonial, but cultural practices with some evaluation and outcome data, you know, that attest to their helpfulness, their therapeutic benefit, their efficacy in some sense. But there are inherent limitations in community interventions that make it hard to do that, as Jalene, you know, and as Professor Venner, you know, from all the work that you've been doing in the Southwest there. So anyway, those are some other thoughts, which are the funding determines so much of what happens in research and in science.
You guys considered working with like small community colleges that service different Native areas and like putting out the kind of research you guys are doing and doing like presentations to them directly, these colleges, just to like get what you guys are really trying to get at out to everyone more broadly, like communities? Because I think that's something you guys should really be thinking about doing. And then you could get like community support, you know, if you get it out to communities.
That's a lovely idea. It's so hard to figure out how to disseminate ideas. And there are some grants specifically targeted to our tribal colleges.
Yeah, we do work with about 19 tribal colleges and universities, and actually developed and designed actually adapted an empirically based intervention to test with in partnership with our community. So I mean, we've done some of that work, and it's important. I think building off of what Joe is expressing, part of the difficulty, I mean, when we did Neopoly, I started with my own professorship funds, basically to pilot it combined with the tribe. The tribe matched the funds, and we launched with about $50,000 to do the testing and development. Having that as a background to create a curriculum and create an approach that then can be translated so that NIH could understand what we were doing was part of the challenge. But I think really the Western systems want to know, well, what's the underlying mechanism that's helping to produce the change? And if you can articulate that in a cultural way, I think people and be able to show some preliminary evidence, which we did, that that seemed to be working. And that's the empirical question to get funded to do the work. So I think there are. I actually think we do a disservice in Indian country quite often, thinking automatically that NIH isn't going to be interested. I think part of it is us having to figure out a translational way to contextualize it so that Western thinkers who have really been trained in a very narrow model can begin to understand not only the what we're doing, but the incredible innovation and impact that this might have if it is successful. And maybe we just hit at an opportune moment, but I think because we had 2 pilot studies that had a lot of qualitative data that supported what we were trying to do. We did bring in the IMB model to help the reader understand it in terms of a mechanism with a mechanistic aspect of change through the original instructions and relational restoration processes, that these are our mechanisms for promoting change. And then they bought it. The other thing is we had a really good design. We kind of slammed them hard with our design. We did a cluster step wedge, randomized cluster step wedge cluster design where we randomized by community. So we had a way of doing this that, basically showed that we had the chops to do it. So I think we can do it. We don't need to undersell ourselves, and we don't have to. The outcome was the same, right? Do we improve physical activity levels? Did we improve eating habits? Did we, that's our goal and our outcome. Do we reduce substance use? So I think it's doable. It's just, it puts the burden on us to really do that translation, that bridge work. So.
Where bicultural and bilingual comes in, right? Being able to speak the language of both worlds and translate it to each other to understand the importance and
and I think we have to also know that sometimes it is incremental, like Joe talked about. But also I'm inspired by the fact that the greatest scientific achievements have never been done through the incremental approach. The greatest scientific achievements have always been through an intuitive process. You think about, the periodic table, the periodic chart, that came through a dream. Yeah, I mean, what happens is Western science quiets the stories of the inspiration by which a great event or a breakthrough happens. The greatest breakthroughs have been people who stand outside of their incremental approach to say, oh, wait a minute. Same with the benzene protein, with benzene, the spiraling of the benzene was a dream about a snake that Kekulé had. So, we discount that inspired aspects or the intuitive process too, that helps to launch us into a new way of thinking. And so NIH won't fund that directly, but I take inspiration from that to say, how can I take that inspired thinking and then translate that in a way that people can begin to understand so that we can build the blocks to move forward.
Wow, what a beautiful closing. So I want to thank all of the speakers again from my heart. I think the heart you put into this, the time, the energy, the passion, and the deep thinking that has had to go into sort of decolonize your own thinking and our socialization is so appreciated in trying to add to our knowledge and try to push the field forward in better ways. Especially for Indigenous people. But I think so much of our Indigenous science really has so much to offer Western science. We could kind of help them get caught up in some certain ways. I don't know if Drs. Duncan or Sobel, I think Dr. Duncan might have had to go teach, would like to say anything at the end. Just wanted to
I'm still here. Rob is teaching. So unless you all want to watch a physics lecture, probably not a good idea to include. So, but we're delighted with the quality of the presentations today, and our thanks to the invited speakers, Dr. Walters, Dr. Ghan. You know, it far exceeded our expectations, and our expectations go beyond just, you know, this monetary prize. Clearly, we're very interested in furthering the academics in this area, and Rob and I both have a very deep tie to Indigenous peoples and respect. And we, in our own humble way, we want to see this furthered through the University of New Mexico and collaborations, not only across the United States, but across the world. And we'd love to see visibility for some of this work at SACNAS in the future. I mean, I think it's a great conference, interdisciplinary STEM conference. And just thanks to you all for your time, your efforts, the administration at UNM for making this possible, especially Jeremy, the VPR, Yolanda. I can't name everyone, but you know, thanks again. And we look forward to continue this again next year. And next year, we're going to have a little more lead time and hopefully get the word out a lot earlier so there can be a broader participation. But thanks so much. And we greatly appreciate all your efforts. Thanks so much, Kamilla.
Well, you're so welcome. It's just thank you again. And I know that there was some thought of thanking and honoring some of the other applicants as well, because there were some very strong applicants, and it was a bit of a process to find the top one. But I think there was a lot of consensus there, but there was a lot of appreciation to the other applicants as well for their work and encouragement to apply again. So thank you all very much. Just wishing you well, sending you off with good energy, and all of our efforts to more of this excellent work.